Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome to Point of View. I'm Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today, and we have got a full and exciting show for you. We're going to start out this hour looking at the problem of homelessness in America, and especially what one Dallas-based organization has been doing to try to address that through their Christian faith. Homelessness has been a problem for a while. Interestingly, Dr. Ben Carson, when he was running the Department of Housing and Urban Development, actually published studies on this and tracking what's happening in among homelessness. The National Alliance to End Homelessness, in their 2020 edition, their latest paper, says 17 out of every 10,000 people in the United States were experiencing homelessness on a single night in January 2019. They're actually taking that from the Department of Urban Development, that's Ben Carson's group. This represents 567,715 people across section of America who were homeless on one particular night. It is a problem. It may be a problem that has been exacerbated by the pandemic and by, here in Texas, the recent storms we had. And so we wanted to reach out to Wayne Walker. He is the pastor and executive director of Our Calling, which is a Dallas-based nonprofit, religiously based organization. Wayne, thank you for joining us. I'm not hearing Wayne.
Wayne.
It seems we may have a technical problem right now. So let me talk a little bit about what this paper says from the state of homelessness in America. So as I mentioned, 17 out of 10,000 people in the United States experienced homelessness on that one night in January. It's a huge number and has become a huge problem for a number of our cities around the country, especially Seattle, San Francisco. If you're tracking the news there, you will find that homelessness has become a real problem for them. We've seen a number of stories of people who just simply don't want to go down into the city because of the homeless problem there. Many of the homeless people are just people who are down on their luck, out of a job and out of a home. But many of them have mental issues, they have health care issues and other things that they have been trying to address for some time. The problem with Seattle, Portland, and San Francisco is they seem to have embraced this issue in some way as a way to try to show how kind they are to the homeless. So they haven't done anything about it. In many cases, they let the homeless run wild. That has created a number of problems for people who are just living downtown and trying to get to the various places where they need to be. And do we have Wayne with us now?
Yes, I'm here.
Wayne, thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me. Really appreciate you guys bringing up this topic. Homeless folks are important to us.
Homelessness is an issue, and I've seen a couple of news stories about your organization and you, and it just looks like an outstanding organization. Tell us a little bit about Our Calling, and my sense is a number of homeless places will touch on faith. You really put the Christian faith out there front. So tell us a little bit about your organization.
Sure, thank you. So Our Calling is a discipleship ministry for the homeless community. Specifically, we focus on the unsheltered. That means people that are not in shelters. Only about 20% of the homeless population are in shelters in Dallas. The other 80% are walking around the streets. They're under bridges. They're living in cars. They're trying to figure out how to survive. And for us, our primary focus are two questions, and we ask these two questions to people every day. One is, will you trust the Lord? Very important. The second is, will you let us help you get off the streets? That is also very important. We want to see men and women come to know the Lord. We want to see them walk with Jesus every day. But we also want to see them get off the streets, and they need a lot more than a blanket and a bus pass and a bottle of water. We want to see the practical application in their lives of getting into a safe, healthy environment. Mm-hmm. Every day we work with victims of human trafficking and sex trafficking and domestic violence. And, homelessness is horrible. And the horrors that people have to live through, we don't want to just pray for them and leave them there, right? Be warm, be filled. But we want to see them actively get off the streets.
Now, when we're trying to reconnect with you, I mentioned that among the homeless population, you've got a lot of people who are just down on their luck, out of a job. They've lost their home for some reason. They're looking for something to do. They're looking for some way to try to build their lives back. But you certainly have some people who have mental health issues and others. How do you address those sort of different populations?
Well, the way we work out the math here, and this is just a simple function, is about 50%, right? About half of the people that we serve are homeless just for a short amount of time, right? Mm-hmm. They're experiencing homelessness. They just lost a job. They need a better job. They need to apologize to somebody, or they just need a little bit of support, and they'll get back on their own. 25% of the population needs what we call short-term care, and that would be like a shelter or, some kind of subsidized housing. They need a little bit of help for a long time or a lot of help for a short time. And, a shelter takes care of all your needs, but it's only for a short time. Where, someone gets you into what's called supportive housing, it may cover the rent for a year or two, but that's it. It's not going to cover any of your, the rest of the stuff you need, like even from toilet paper to food or, mm-hmm. All the support services that you need. 15% of our population, though, needs long-term care. 15% need almost like skilled nursing, right? They need assisted living every day, like you were mentioning, mental health care. They need addictive recovery services on a daily basis. They need someone to give them a meal. They need someone to give them their meds. And about 10% of our population are just dying on the streets or hospice. 2 weeks ago, we were operating the convention center for the city of Dallas. We had about 1,200 people there seeking emergency shelter. And, over 50% of those people are over 50 years old, right? So these aren't just young folks that come in. We have people in their 70s. We have people in their 80s that are living on the streets, and even 90s. People that, you can't just say, hey, go get a job, get back in the workplace and go, right? These are folks that have significant challenges, or people that have major physical disabilities, right? They're missing a limb, or they've got cancer, or they've got, Hodgkin's, and they've got AIDS, and they've got, all kinds of different significant challenges. And it just feels like sometimes some of these individuals are just dumped on the streets because families just don't know what to do with them.
Our guest for this segment is Wayne Walker. He is a pastor and executive director of Our Calling. That is a nonprofit organization, Christian faith-based organization that deals with homeless people. They're based here in Dallas, and they have a number of experiences about that. If you want to find out more about Our Calling, and I encourage you to, we have a link to their website at pointofview.net, so you can go over there and find out more about Wayne and Our Calling, and I'd like you to do that. When we come back, we're going to find out a little bit more about how they're addressing some of the problems, especially that we've seen through the pandemic and with the storms we've had here in Texas. So stay with us, and we'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You know, Christians are surrounded by a supermarket of worldviews, so it's not surprising that many have uncritically accepted many of these false views of reality. The Barna Group, in association with Summit Ministries, conducted a survey of practicing Christians to determine how they were influenced by these worldviews. What they found is that younger Christians, that would be millennials and Generation X, were much more likely to accept unbiblical worldviews than previous generations. And they also found that males were more susceptible than females by a 2-to-1 ratio. They found that more than 6 in 10 of practicing Christians accept some ideas that are rooted in the new spirituality. They also found that more than a third of practicing Christians are sympathetic to some teachings of Islam. Apparently, these practicing Christians do not see how some of their views are illogical. For example, more than a quarter believe that all people pray to the same God or spirit. Praying to Allah, Krishna, or the God of the Bible would obviously be very different, but that does not seem to many of these Christians to be a contradiction. On issues of morality and values, many also differ from Orthodox Christianity. Nearly a quarter of them believe that what is morally right or wrong depends on what an individual believes. 1 in 5 believe that meaning and purpose come from working hard. A significant number also accept ideas promoted by socialism. Some strongly agree with the idea that the government, rather than individuals, should control as much of the resources as necessary to ensure that everyone gets a fair share, and others believe that private property encourages greed and envy. This survey is but one more reminder that we need to be teaching sound theology in our churches. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we're back. Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. And on the phone with me is Wayne Walker. He is a pastor and executive director of Our Calling, which is a Dallas-based homeless shelter, I guess you would say. Wayne, do you consider yourself a shelter? Because you kind of distinguish yourself different from shelters. Oh, we've apparently lost him again. We'll get him back here in just a second. But anyway, they on their website they describe it as on Our Calling, homelessness is a symptom of a deeper, broader problem, more than a sandwich and a blanket. The desperate and broken need hope and healing. They need a new way to live, a changed mind and a changed heart. Our version is to help people discover the reasons for their condition and the emotional and material resources to live beyond their challenges. Wayne, are you back with us?
I am. Sorry to answer your question. No, we're not a shelter. No one sleeps at our facility. It's more of an outreach center, so it's discipleship every single day.
So what do you do if somebody comes there and they are homeless? Do you help them find a shelter or someplace to go?
Yes, our facility is actually the main referral point through the city of Dallas. So we connect people to about 20 agencies local and about 120 agencies nationwide. So from COVID testing to medical to mental health care to shower to laundry to a hot lunch, we've got all that at our facility. We've got doctors, we've got people that can help you with medications and help you, just with whatever's going on in your current state. as we love and have a church service and discipleship and help you grow closer to the Lord, we're definitely every day trying to get people into shelter and into long-term housing.
Now, that reminds me that I have done that a few times in the past. I've worked at a place where in downtown Dallas, we were just volunteering, but we would help prepare the food, hand out the food, hot meals to people who were coming in. They would have a service, a Christian service right before that, and once they were finished, they would come through the line, get the food. So, do you have a service before or after the meals or something?
Well, we do have services every day. We do not believe that Jesus is a requirement to get a meal, and so what we always say is Jesus is not the chips and salsa. We want to provide a voluntary opportunity for people to come in and go to a Bible study. And because of that, our Bible studies are full. Our men's Bible study is crazy full. Women's Bible studies, our church service. We want to love anybody that walks in here. Some people come in, honestly, they may be mad at God. They might blame God for their condition. Maybe they've been praying that the Lord would take away an addiction or help restore their family, and it hasn't happened. And, to require that guy to sit through a Bible study to eat lunch, I just don't see that being a scriptural methodology, right? We want to be able to love on the person as we walk with them to Jesus. Do
you do breakfast, lunch, and dinner, just lunch? What do you do there?
We're serving a breakfast and lunch. Our facility closes about 5 p.m.
Mm-hmm.
We try to get people into shelters. Those that stay outside, they'll come back and see us the next day. But right now it's a breakfast and lunch, and it's 5 days a week now. COVID changed our schedule a little bit. We used to be open on Saturdays. COVID changed a lot of things, of course, everywhere in the world.
Mm-hmm.
We serve a couple of thousand meals a week.
Now, speaking of COVID, when the pandemic hit, that hit a lot of people financially. I mean, a lot of people. Of course, we've had the issues of people having not being able to make their rent, not being able to make their house payments. I suspect a number of them ended up having to leave their apartments or wherever they were staying. Have you seen your numbers increase significantly over this past year?
Yes. This time last year, we were seeing about 30 new people a week. That means 30 people that we had just seen for the first time that just became homeless, or we just were able to connect with them.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're seeing sometimes up to 150 new people a week. So the number of people that are becoming homeless, experiencing homelessness for the first time. Our facility, we have this big facility downtown, 32,000 square feet. We have 300 to 500 people a day that come and see us. It used to be people that walk in, and it still is a lot of that, but now we also have cars lined up down the street of people, families and individuals that are living in their cars, have just become homeless and don't know where else to go.
So is it a hot meal that you serve them or something different?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's a hot meal. We kind of measure dignity with the question, would your mom, right? Would your mom eat that? And so we want to serve a hot meal that's clean, in a great facility where someone can come in and take a hot shower and do their laundry and get on the internet and connect to doctors and pastors and chaplains and even go to a Bible study today.
Now, last week on Point of View, we talked, a couple of times at least, about the storms that hit us here in Texas, and especially North Dallas got hit very hard. And that you had flooding for a lot of people. They had to get out of their house. You had, I've actually heard some news stories of some shelters that had water pipes break, and they had to get people out of the shelter because of the water pipe and the damage there. Did you see an increase over the past couple of weeks just related to the storms?
Well, so we're not a shelter and no one sleeps at our facility, but when it drops below freezing, we stay open 24 hours. And so 2 weeks ago when the weather started, we started getting more people than we could hold in our building. So we reached out to the city of Dallas, and they let us, with our partners, open up the convention center. The first night we had about 100 people there, but it grew up to about 1,200. And so we had homeless folks that were staying in hotels, and the hotel got shut down with no power. And other places, that had busted pipes. Our own facility had busted pipes. We had guys all last week trying to fix all the sheetrock and paint. But yeah, many facilities around town, homeless centers and shelters and, rehabs and recovery places had significant damage. I know now we have 2 domestic violence centers that have had significant damage in Dallas.
And you depend primarily on volunteers coming in and helping out with the meals and so forth. Am I correct on that?
It is. We have about 40 staff members, and then we have a lot of volunteers that we need every day. You know, people go to our website at ourcalling.org and try to figure out ways that they can volunteer and, you know, participate in what we're doing. In 2020, last year, we lost a bunch of volunteers. Just people didn't feel comfortable coming. It was unfortunate. You know, we were open the whole time, and, you know, we've got every CDC guidelines here, including COVID testing every day for our homeless friends. But we desperately need people that can come help serve a meal, lead a Bible study, or fold T-shirt.
And where are you located in downtown Dallas? You're in downtown or close to it?
We are. We're on Cesar Chavez, just south of 30, 1702 South Cesar Chavez. So we're just across Cesar Chavez from Farmers Market. And so it's a perfect location. We're within a half a mile of about 4 shelters.
Now, explain a little bit how you work with the city. I mean, you pointed out that the city uses you to help spread people out to the shelters. How does that work?
So every day people come into our facility and we can get them COVID tested and we can get them referred into a shelter. You know, we play a unique role in collaboration with all these different agencies, trying to figure out, you know, how we can bring the city to the table, as well as different ministries, some of them, you know, God-fearing and some of them secular, on how to connect people to the services they need. You know, one of the conversations we're having right now is about the vaccine, right? So when the county makes the vaccine available to the homeless community, you know, how can we help them fulfill that? You know, our teams not only serve downtown, but we visit over 1,500 locations all over Dallas. We have teams that go under bridges, deep in the woods. And, you know, a lot of people know us because we have an app, and people download the Our Calling app on their phone, and you can find the closest homeless shelter to you anywhere in the country through our app. But in the Dallas area, people can report where they see homelessness, right? You see a tent under a bridge, you can report that to us so our teams can go serve them.
It's an important point because they've been pointing out that the new Johnson & Johnson vaccine is a one-dose vaccine, and that's going to work better for people who are homeless or transient and so forth. So will you be will y'all be administering vaccines there?
Well, we're in discussions with the county now and with Parkland, our county hospital system, to figure out how that's going to work. We do a lot of medical services here at our facility. We desperately need more nurses and doctors to volunteer here because we have a lot of elder care kind of needs. But we're working with them to figure out how that's going to work with a single dose shot.
Our guest for this segment, and I think he's going to stay with us for one more segment, is Wayne Walker. He is a pastor and executive director of Our Calling. And so if you're not sure, how do you describe your organization? What's the one name that you use for it?
We're a discipleship ministry for the homeless community.
Discipleship ministry for the homeless community. And they work with the homeless, trying to get them into the proper shelters, get them the care they need. If you want to find out more about Our Calling or Wayne, you can go to pointofview.net, and we have information about him there, on him, about the organization and him there, and contact information for him. Stay with us. We'll be back for one more segment with Wayne Walker.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back to Point of View. This is Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. And on the phone with me is Wayne Walker. He is a pastor and executive director of Our Calling, which works with the homeless. Wayne, you mentioned you went through some very interesting statistics earlier in the show about the kind of people who come in and the kind of challenges they have. Give me an idea, if you have one, about the success rate, the goal here is to try to get people who are down on their luck, homeless, facing issues, the help they need in order to get back on their feet. Do you have a sense as to how many of these, some kind of broad percentage of people are able to eventually do that?
Well, thanks for asking. That's a great question. I'm going to change the question up a little bit. It's kind of like asking how many people can we share the gospel with? 100% of the people that come in here, we're going to love on them with the love of Christ. We're going to love our neighbor well. We're going to point them to Jesus. We're going to offer them opportunities to get off the streets. But we live in a city that doesn't have a lot of resources. Mm-hmm. Dallas does not have enough shelter beds. We do not have enough low-income housing. So a significant problem with trying to get people off the streets is not that we don't offer it. It's not that they don't want it. It's that it doesn't exist. Dallas hasn't added any significant shelter space in over 11 years. And yet you can think of the millions of people that have moved here in that time. And all the cities around Dallas, all the suburbs, most of them don't have any infrastructure for the poor. They just send all their poverty to Dallas and the downtown area. So we are able to see many, many people get off the streets, hundreds a month sometimes. But, you know, when more and more come, more and more people are experiencing homelessness for the first time. We also don't have enough housing. That's why we launched a capital campaign. We're trying to build a significant number of fully supported, 24-hour supported housing in Dallas to help folks that are experiencing homelessness get off the streets for the rest of their lives.
Now, you mentioned an interesting point when you said Dallas doesn't do this. Is this an obligation of the city, the county, the state, or private organizations? My sense is a number of churches step up to try to help out on this, but who bears the burden here?
Well, I think we as the body of Christ bear the burden as we are called to love our neighbor well. You know, we would want Caesar to give to Caesar what Caesar's and give to the Lord's. And, you know, we spend a lot of money on taxes on a lot of different things to help a lot of people, but there's not enough tax money to go around for all the needs. And that's why Christian nonprofits exist. We have stepped in to be the hands and feet of Christ to help people in the way that the church should. And the church should be able to help people with more than just a meal and a handout. You know, often a church will call homeless ministry, we're going to go on the streets and pray for somebody and hand them a sandwich. Well, that's great, but you wouldn't call that ministry with anybody else in your church. You wouldn't call that ministry to a single mom or ministry to kids in your church or seniors or adults or married couples. You want to invest time with those people. So when you talk about ministry, we want to invest significant time with people, helping them walk with Jesus, teaching them what it means to follow him every day.
You know, you have much more experience about this than I do, but my rather small experience with people who are really down on their luck, in many cases homeless and so forth, is many of them are very praiseful people. I mean, they're trusting in God. They do this vocally. I mean, they talk about their reliance on God. It's very interesting to see how many of them that I have seen over the years use it as a time for praise.
Oh, absolutely. You know, unfortunately, the caricature that most people have for homelessness is a panhandler, when in fact, most panhandlers that I've met, and I've met thousands of them, are not homeless at all. They make enough money to stay in any hotel in Dallas. They're making a significant amount of money on the same corners every day, up to $50 an hour. I know a guy that makes a whole lot more than that right now. But that's the caricature that most people think of homelessness. However, if you go under a bridge or you meet someone where they are, you visit them in their tent, you do find a number of people that know the Lord, love the Lord, want to walk and grow with him. They just don't have a place to go. Most churches, you know, kind of turn people away at the door that haven't taken a shower or, you know, look like they haven't shaved in a while. And so we want to be the hands and feet of Christ to those folks that really have nowhere else to go.
What do we need to do to try to address this problem? You sort of touched on it, but what do we need to do? Does the city, does the state need to invest more? I assume the city does some of this. My recollection is it's not really a county obligation, but I may be wrong about that. Is this a city or a state obligation, or what do we need to do?
You know, I get scared when we talk about making everything the government's responsibility. Mm-hmm. You know, I don't think they've done well with our health care, and they sure don't do well with some of the other things. You know, we are called to love our neighbors well, and all of us are called to actively participate in helping our community. it's if you look at the Old Testament, it's God's people that were called to take care of widows and orphans and the poor. Many of the people we serve have no family. They don't have anybody to defend them or protect them or care for them. And I think it's an opportunity of the body of Christ to not point at the government and say, hey, why aren't you doing more? But to really point at ourselves, right? We are called to love our neighbors as ourselves. We are called to care for people that are downtrodden. We are called to help the one that has nothing to eat, has nothing to wear. And I think as the body of Christ, we can come together. And what we can do is we can all participate. We can all volunteer. We can all give. We can all participate in helping our brothers and sisters.
It's an interesting point because I often hear our more liberal friends saying that what they want to do is our Christian calling is that we should be spending more federal government money to help the homeless and help the poor and so forth. And they cite the New Testament for doing that, but I keep going back to them saying, but it sounds to me like the New Testament's the burden is upon us as individual Christians to help. It is not on us to give money to the government and let the government decide who is helped.
Well, at the end of the day, I don't think it really matters who pays the bills as long as the bills are paid, right? We can say it's the government's responsibility or the church's responsibility, and we can argue that for millennia, but the guy still doesn't have a place to live. And until the government stands up or until the church stands up, one of them has to say, we are called to love our neighbors and do what's necessary. And if that means that our church come together and each church picks one person experiencing homelessness and tries to get them off the streets, that's what it takes. There are enough churches in Dallas that if every church adopted just two people, and helped them get off the streets, we wouldn't have a homeless problem anywhere in the city. And that's probably true of every city in the country, right? Instead of giving money out your car window and, getting a guy a stack of blankets to help him so he doesn't freeze, how about getting resources together to help the person get a home, to help them get into a safe place where they can be loved in love, a place where they can have their family, a place where they can be a part of a community.
But it is fair to say, isn't it, that there's going to be, there's a percentage, I assume it's probably a fairly small percent, that for some reason they've just sort of adopted and seem to like this kind of life, homeless life, living in tents and other things, maybe because it allows them to engage with drugs or other things that they might not be able to do if they're living a more stable life and so forth. There's going to be some cases we're not going to be able to help. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I met a guy last week who can't walk. He can't move himself around in a wheelchair. He can't feed himself. He can't go to the bathroom on his own. And if you ask him what he needs more than anything, he's going to tell you he wants some vodka. And he wants it because he has so many hurts in his body and in his mind and his heart, and that's the only thing he's ever found to help ease that pain. Now, what he needs is a nursing home, right? Now, is he able to make the choices to really care for his body? Until then, we as the body of Christ need to not look at him and judge him by the way he carries his burdens, but really look at him by the burdens that he actually carries. He needs to know that he is loved by the Lord and he has value, and he needs the body of Christ to not condemn him because he drinks. I mean, there's a lot of people listening to this show right now that probably drink, right? Now, that doesn't mean they're homeless because of it, but every single one of us struggle with sin. And as the body of Christ, we need to recognize that Jesus didn't come to condemn the world, and neither should we.
It's a very important point. My guest has been Wayne Walker. He is the executive director and a pastor, but he's executive director of Our Calling, which is a Dallas-based ministry that works with the homeless to try to get them in shelters and other places. If you want to find out more about Wayne, you can go to pointofview.net. We have information there about him. We have a link to Our Calling, so you can go and look at that, find out what they're about, and maybe even donate. We would encourage you to do so. Wayne, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for your time. Please, please pray for the homeless. If you can remember anything today, please pray for people experiencing homelessness.
Very good point. When we come back, we're going to talk about Joe Biden and his proposal for expanding Medicare. So stay with us. We'll be back on Point of View in just a minute.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back. Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby today. And I wanted to talk a little bit about Joe Biden's proposal to expand Medicare from the current enrollment age of 65 to the age of 60, so 5 years younger. President Biden has been proposing a lot of laws and making executive actions and so forth that are they're going to just increase spending dramatically. There's the $1.9 trillion relief bill that the House just passed the House. That goes to the Senate. They're going to try to take that up this week. Probably won't pass identically as it did in the House because it looks like they're not going to be able to get the minimum wage increase in the Senate version. And if that's the case, then they'll have to go back. If the Senate does pass something and it's different from the House version, they'll have to go back and do a compromise because both the House and Senate have to pass identical legislation before the president can sign it. So it may be going back to the House. But one of the things that Biden wants to do is expand Medicare. He made that campaign promise when he was running for president. And there's a very important reason why he wants to expand Medicare from the age of 65, lower the enrollment age to 60. That's because Obamacare has been such a disaster. It has been a failure. And Medicare ends up being very popular with seniors, so he wants to expand it. Had Obamacare been all that Democrats repeatedly had promised and falsely promised, recall President Barack Obama back in 2013 said if you like your health insurance plan, you will be able to keep your health insurance plan. That earned him PolitiFact's Lie of the Year award in 2013. But had Obamacare worked the way they thought it was going to work, there would be no need to expand Medicare. And that's because what they did with Obamacare is they said, all right, we're going to eliminate pre-existing conditions. We're not going to have those. So if you're an older person, you're more likely to have a pre-existing condition. That was eliminated in private health insurance. They decided they were going to increase subsidies, provide subsidies for people to make health insurance more affordable. Older people tended to have more issues in health insurance. If they were going out in the individual market and buying it, it was more expensive for them. So they're providing subsidies that taxpayers are paying for to offset the cost of it. And then they were also going to try to adjust the premiums. So typically, if you were a senior who went, if let's say you were downsized, you went into, you lost your job at the age of 60 or 61 or 62, and you were going to go out and buy your own individual policy in the individual health insurance market, it was going to be more expensive just because of your age, just like life insurance is. And that was because of the age factor. So they said, we're going to lower that so that we're going to adjust it so that older people will be paying less so that younger people end up having to pay more for it. So you got as an older person, you got a break in the health insurance cost, you got subsidies, and there was no pre-existing conditions. So if all those had worked as Democrats said they would, that would end up meaning that it was going to be much more affordable for people, and it would be a great option for seniors. But if you'll remember, when Democrats went forward as presidential candidates and they were campaigning on this issue, every one of them criticized Obamacare. Every one of them said, this is we have terrible health insurance out there. We need to eat. Most of them said, create a Medicare for all, just to give it over to the government, let government run the health care system. Joe Biden said, no, we need to fix Obamacare and improve it. But all of those Democrats, the plans they were criticizing, that was Obamacare. And I did not hear one debate anchor in those programs say, well, Kamala, you're talking about all these problems here with the healthcare system, but isn't that the Obamacare legislation that you voted on? They didn't do that. So as a result, the reason it is a problem for seniors is because Obamacare has been such a failure. Now, a number of Democrats over the years have supported what they call a Medicare buy-in. And what that meant was somebody age 55 or 60 could buy into the Medicare program. They usually didn't talk about it. They usually said they were going to have to pay it themselves. My guess is they would have, if the legislation ever went anywhere, they would actually provide some subsidies there. But essentially, you would buy into the Medicare program and you would pay the premiums yourself. Those premiums tend to be fairly high because older people have higher cost. But at any rate, that had been a standard proposal. But Joe Biden rejected that. He simply said, I want to lower the rates, not a buy-in. I want to lower the rates, the age to age 60. And he went on to say in his campaign promise, I'm quoting now, any new federal cost associated with this option would be financed out of general revenue, that is taxpayers, to protect the Medicare trust fund. So essentially taxpayers are going to pay for it. But what is this Medicare trust fund that he's talking about? Well, there is a Social Security trust fund. You may have heard about that. It's supposed to have $2.7 trillion in there. The government has borrowed all that money and left it with IOUs, but at least it's supposed to have that much. There is a Medicare Part A trust fund. It pays for hospital bills only. That's what it covers. That's part of the 2.9% payroll tax. If you're working, you make payroll taxes, that's going to pay for the trust fund. But the Medicare Trust Fund only has $155 billion in it, and the Congressional Budget Office expects it's going to be depleted in 3 more years. So you do have a trust fund. It doesn't have a lot of money in it, but that only pays for hospital bills. In addition, seniors pay monthly premiums for Part B, that's physician expenses, and for Part D, that's prescription drugs. But both of those premiums only pay for 25% of the program. 75% is covered by taxpayers. So it's an important distinction when seniors say, well, we actually paid for this. No, in fact, you didn't. Taxpayers are paying for a lot of it. And it's a big amount. A male worker, this comes from the Urban Institute, a male worker who made the median income his entire career and retired at age 65 in 2020 can expect to receive from Social Security just about what he paid in. But with Medicare, he would have paid in on average about $81,000 over his working career. That's in Medicare payroll taxes. But he can expect to receive $240,000. In other words, it would be a net benefit to the person of about $160,000 over his retirement career. That's for a single. But if you had a single person if you have a person who's married, and you had a one worker family, and he's a low wage earner, he could expect to pay in about $36,000 in Medicare, but both the worker and the spouse, probably the wife, would be allowed to be under Medicare, and they could expect to spend about $522,000 over their retirement. So you can see the difference. The point being is, if we move to Joe Biden's Medicare program expansion, we're going to be spending a whole lot more money for a program that is already on its way to bankruptcy. So it's just not something we need to be doing. At least some of the Democrats who had proposed a Medicare buy-in were proposing money coming into the system. Joe Biden's plan really doesn't bring any additional money into the system. In fact, it becomes a cost if you lower that retirement age from 65 down to 60, and we're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars in taxpayer money to pay for those people. You're going to make that cost even higher. So we need to push back on that, because that is just a cost we can't do. If Obamacare had worked, they wouldn't even need this. When we come back for the next hour, we're turning to all things gun with Dr. H. Sterling Burnett. Joe Biden came out 2 weeks ago. 8 levels, see what's out there, and Sterling will address some of those comments that are being tossed around right now about what we need to do on guns. So stay with us here on Point of View. We'll be back in just a minute.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/sign-up. pointofview.net/sign-up. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week. in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
Welcome to Point of View. I'm Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. We're going to be talking guns this hour. When we turn to the next hour, we're going to talk with John Berlau, and his new book, George Washington, Entrepreneur. He's got a whole new take on George Washington, our first president, and I think you'll find that very interesting. I'm going to start out this hour by reading a quote from President Joe Biden. He, on February 14, 2 weeks ago, that's the 3-year anniversary of the Parkland shooting, he gave an address, and he closed it out by saying, "This administration will not wait for the next mass shooting to heed that call. We will take action to end our epidemic of gun violence and make our schools and communities safer. Today, I am calling on Congress to enact common-sense gun law reforms, including requiring background checks on all gun sales, banning assault weapons and high-capacity magazines, and eliminating immunity for gun manufacturers who knowingly put weapons of war on our streets. We owe it to all those who have lost and to those who and all those left behind to grieve to make a change. The time to act is now." On the phone with me today is my go-to person for gun issues, Dr. H. Sterling Burnett. He has been with the Heartland Institute out of Chicago since 2014. Prior to that, he was with the National Center for Policy Analysis for a number of years, I think probably 20 years or so. That's when I first met him, back in the mid-19s, early 1990s. Sterling is a graduate of Southern Methodist University, and he got a master's and a PhD in philosophy from Bowling Green State University, and he is joining us now. Sterling, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on again, Merrill.
Sterling has had a long time interest in guns. He is an expert on these issues. He typically writes on environmental policy, but he could just as easily, or perhaps better, write on gun issues because he knows these things so well. So you heard what Joe Biden said about what he'd like to see from gun legislation coming through Congress. Let's start with that. He wants to say these are common sense reforms, and he wants to try to get some of these things passed. My guess is he's going to have some trouble with them. But what about the background checks? Where are we on that? Congress has been talking about this for some time.
I was about to say, he sounds like he's breaking new ground here. He wants to make it sound like that, but it's old wine in new bottles. None of these proposals are new. They've all been around. I mean, remember, they implemented an a so-called assault weapons ban. They're not really assault weapons. By the military definition of the term, they're not fully automatic weapons. But they implemented that under Clinton. That's not new. that's three presidents ago, 4 presidents ago. So he's not breaking any new ground here. And it's not clear whether any of these proposals would be constitutional. You know, anything he did, even if he gets it through the legislature, will be challenged in court, and none of it will have any effect on crime. So it's window dressing. The Democrats, at least a majority of them, the leadership, have long been in the bag for gun control because they don't care about the Constitution's First Amendment. They don't care about the Constitution's Second Amendment. They don't care about property rights, the Fifth Amendment. So I suspect his first proposal was all gun sales, background checks.
Right. So we do have background checks now to some extent, don't we?
No, most gun sales are covered by background checks. And it doesn't matter where they take place. If you buy a gun from a licensed dealer, you go through a background check. Most guns are sold through licensed dealers, whether it's at a gun store or a gun show. It doesn't matter where. Licensed dealer sells it out of the back of his car. If he's a licensed dealer, you go through a background check. What he's trying to regulate is private gun sales. I transfer, if I had a child, my grandfather transferred guns to me. I have to go through a background check to get my grandfather's guns. My neighbor wants a gun, and I've got one. He wants to regulate that. It's not clear to me where he thinks they get the authority. First off, these aren't interstate commerce things right here. So it's not clear where the federal government gets the authority to say, if I want to transfer a gun to my neighbor, I should have to go through a background check under interstate commerce. It's not clear where constitutionally the federal government has granted that power. This is, they initially targeted something called a gun show loophole. They said, oh, well, people are buying guns at gun shows. Most people at gun shows are actual gun dealers. Mm-hmm. So most of those sales go through backgrounds. But some people get old and they want to get rid of their guns. And so they buy a booth at a gun show, and they sell off their collection. And he wants to make sure every one of them goes through background checks. Now, the real problem is who's going to go through this and who's going to undertake it. You can't, as a private person, I can't call up the FBI and say, look, I'm going to sell my gun to my neighbor. So could you run a background check for me? They can't. They don't deal with private individuals. They deal with licensed gun dealers. So what he's really saying is every sale has to go through a licensed gun dealer. So I'd have to transfer my gun to a licensed gun dealer. Let's say I want to leave a gun to my son or grandson, give a gun to my son or grandson. I'd have to go to a licensed gun dealer, say, here's the gun I bought for my grandson. You buy it from me, and then you sell it to him.
I've bought one gun in my...
It issues a lot of, it's a lot of complications to private sales, which are a very small percentage. And who's not going to comply with this? Criminals. Sorry, I would buy a gun on the streets to commit a crime. I'm a felon, so I shouldn't have a gun anyway. But I'm going to go through that background check.
Well, that was going to be one of my questions. Is we've only got about a minute left, but my sense is most of the crimes that go on with guns by are not registered guns or went through background checks. Is that correct?
Well, that's correct. Most of them are either stolen, they're bought on black markets. The black markets aren't going to be regulated by this any more than black market drugs are going to be regulated. Are regulated. So this will have no impact on crime. It only serves to complicate matters for law-abiding citizens, making it difficult for them to transfer their private guns to people, whether it's a sale to a neighbor or to their own family.
My guest for this hour is H. Sterling Burnett, Dr. Burnett. He is a expert on guns. He's with the Heartland Institute. If you want to find out more about Sterling or the Heartland Institute, you can go to pointofview.net, and we have information up there and contact information for him. So when we come back, we're going to go through a couple more of President Biden's proposals for what he would like to see done. And this one has to do with assault weapons, and another putting more liability on gun manufacturers. Apparently, we want to try to sue them if somebody takes something that was made for one purpose and uses it for something completely different. So stay with us. We're going to be back with Dr. Sterling Burnett in just a minute.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You know, Christians are surrounded by a supermarket of worldviews, so it's not surprising that many have uncritically accepted many of these false views of reality. The Barna Group, in association with Summit Ministries, conducted a survey of practicing Christians to determine how they were influenced by these worldviews. What they found is that younger Christians, that would be millennials and Generation X, were much more likely to accept unbiblical worldviews than previous generations. And they also found that males were more susceptible than females by a 2-to-1 ratio. They found that more than 6 in 10 of practicing Christians accept some ideas that are rooted in the new spirituality. They also found that more than a third of practicing Christians are sympathetic to some teachings of Islam. Apparently, these practicing Christians do not see how some of their views are illogical. For example, more than a quarter believe that all people pray to the same God or spirit. Praying to Allah, Krishna, or the God of the Bible would obviously be very different, but that does not seem to many of these Christians to be a contradiction. On issues of morality and values, many also differ from Orthodox Christianity. Nearly a quarter of them believe that what is morally right or wrong depends on what an individual believes. 1 in 5 believe that meaning and purpose come from working hard. A significant number also accept ideas promoted by socialism. Some strongly agree with the idea that the government, rather than individuals, should control as much of the resources as necessary to ensure that everyone gets a fair share, and others believe that private property encourages greed and envy. This survey is but one more reminder that we need to be teaching sound theology in our churches. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we're back. We're talking guns this hour and President Joe Biden's proposal for gun legislation. 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212 if you'd like to talk to Sterling. Dr. H. Sterling Burnett is with us from the Heartland Institute, and we're talking about the gun issues that President Biden has proposed, and also we'll be looking at some of the state issues. So if you have a question or a comment for Sterling, 1-800-351-1212. Sterling, he also wants to address the issue of assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. I remember us having a major national discussion about this after the Las Vegas shooting, if I recall correctly, and of course, the bump stock issue there. So where are we on that issue?
Well, like I said, once again, it's nothing new. They actually passed an assault weapons ban. They did research, and they found that it had no impact on crime whatsoever. It did not reduce murders, did not, because assault weapons are used, so-called assault weapons are used in so few crimes. But when it happens, they're very visible, but sometimes they're used to stop crimes, and nobody wants to talk about that. When an assault weapons was used in a church here in Texas a couple of years ago,
oh, yes.
Several people were killed. What stopped that? It wasn't the police. It was a man, it was a private citizen with his own assault weapon that stopped that guy. Had he not been there, more people would be dead today. It's not uncommon. The funny thing is, the whole assault weapon thing, we've had semi-automatic firearms for over 100 years. Military surplus firearms used to be sold. M1 carbines were sold. They're semi-automatic, so-called assault weapons, even though they're only semi-automatic. You pull the trigger once, it fires once, not multiple firing. this wasn't an issue. Very few people wanted them. Now, some hunting groups have pushed this for hunting varmints, but the whole drive to own assault weapons came when government first started trying to ban assault weapons. When you try and take something away, Americans are pretty suspicious of the federal government coming in and saying, you can't own this. That's something you could own before. Because why? Well, because it's not good for you. People don't like that. So they started, every time they talk about banning assault weapons, they drive assault weapons sales. Well, they go through the roof. Now these things are the most popular firearms being sold today. You're going to have millions of these in private ownership. And what happens to those that are in private ownership already?
Let's talk a little bit about that, because I've heard people complaining for the past, I'm going to say 6 or 8 months, that you just can't buy ammunition out there. And this was before Joe Biden was elected president. If I remember right, when Barack Obama was elected president, National Rifle Association applications shot through the roof. People started buying those things. I mean, it's almost like if a Democrat is in, you want to go buy the stock in the gun companies or the ammunition companies, because they seem to be doing really well at that time.
Yeah, I remember there used to be posters at gun stores of Barack Obama, National Gun Salesman of the Year. I suspect we'll be seeing those posters with Biden's face on now. Like I said, the more things change, the more they remain the same. This is not a new proposal. They've done it before. It had no effect on crime. If it's not going to affect crime, if it's not going to reduce murders, if it's not going to end up reducing deaths, then what's the use? Well, you're left to wonder. If it doesn't do that, then why is government trying to do it? And it's about control. And that's what people don't trust. When the government just wants to control you for no good purpose, and the research shows there was no good purpose, then why? So you have more assault weapons being sold than have ever been sold before. Simply because they don't trust the government, because they think, they know it's no good purpose. It will have no impact on crime.
Why
what it does do for the Democrats, or for those in power, is it's one more step down the slippery slope of what they used to call, complete gun control. Mm-hmm. We want registration for everybody in the United States. We want to control, and expand the number of people who are banned from owning guns. It's easier to do if you've taken one class of guns out of ownership, if you've registered everything else, if you say every sale has to go through a federal gun dealer. So it's a dangerous precedent, and worst of all, it's no good for crime. It won't do anything.
The shortage of ammunition was around before Joe Biden was elected. Why is there a shortage? I would have thought that the gun manufacturers would have said, or the ammunition manufacturers would have said, we got a market out there. We got to step up production.
Well, I can't explain all of it. I know under Obama they had part of a shortage because there was a shortage of brass. Mm-hmm. You used to get a lot of used spent brass that was reformed into ammunition on the private market, but Obama stopped allowing used brass to be sold back to the market. So, but I don't know if that has anything to do with the shortage now. It's just more and more people are buying. Look, gun sales have gone through the roof. It was a record last year. And it's a new market because 40% of the gun sales, it's my understanding, I haven't seen all the federal data, but it's my understanding that 40% of the new gun sales last year were to, if not first-time buyers, they were to women and minorities. So that's a growing segment of the market. Mm-hmm. Now, what's this response to? It was response to lockdowns, fear. Could it have been response to the fact that public officials were saying we got to get rid of the police? Well, anyone knows if you say defund the police, you're saying crime's going to go up. And, of course, that's precisely what happened. When you have riots on the street, some shop owner, some small shop owner who sees his building trashed and burned to the ground, and the police don't show up, or they show up and then they leave without arresting anyone because they've been told, hands off, we don't want to make this worse. Well, you're left to your own devices. And even if you never owned a gun before, you might own one now.
What about Joe Biden's third proposal about eliminating immunity for certain crimes that are done with guns?
Well, now, that's not what he's saying. What he's saying is he wants to basically allow attorneys general and private parties to sue gun shops, and not gun shops, gun manufacturers for the guns that they sell. We say what you will about tobacco. It was a legal product that people used. It's addictive, and so it's got one mark against it that almost every other legal product doesn't have. But we have a problem right now in this country where oil companies are being sued for the cost of climate change. Now, I know people at Exxon. I've bought products from probably every oil company being sued. Not one of them ever stuck a gun to my head and said, buy this product or else. We buy it because it's useful to us. We put it to use for transportation, yet they're being sued everywhere by cities and states who use their product for the damage they claim it's doing to the climate. Well, stop using it. Then it does no damage, right? But that's not what they're doing. They want to continue using the product, but then they want the big pockets. Well, with gun makers, back in the late 90s, some lawyers got an idea, let's go for the deep pocket. Let's sue gun makers for selling guns, for making guns, because they're used in crime. It's like suing a car manufacturer because I drive a Chevy and I ran over somebody. Let's sue Chevy.
And
not for defects, not for defects, mind you, not because the products don't work properly or blow up in your face or something like that. That's product liability. They want to sue them just for putting a product on the street that some people use to commit crimes.
My guest for this hour is Dr. H. Sterling Burnett. He is with the Heartland Institute, and we're talking about the various proposals that President Joe Biden has suggested for gun legislation at the federal level. When we come back, we're going to talk about at the state level, because a lot of states have looked at imposing more and more restrictions on guns, and I think even cities have as well. If you'd like to talk to Sterling Burnett or you have a question, 1-800-351-1212. 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to find out more about him, you can go to pointofview.net, or you can go to the Heartland Institute. We have a link to the Heartland Institute on the pointofview.net website, and you can find out about what they do at Heartland. They do a whole range of they cover a range of different public policy topics. Sterling typically writes on the environment there, but they cover health care and taxes and budgets and just a range of different things. So it's a sort of a full service think tank based there in Chicago. They've been around for, I think, probably 30 years now or so, or even more. But anyway, I'd encourage you to go there and take a look at that. When we come back with Sterling Burnett, we'll take, I think we've got one question coming in, but we'll come back and talk about state efforts to reform gun laws. We'll be back in just a minute.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back. Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson on Point of View today. If you'd like to talk to our guest, Dr. H. Sterling Burnett of the Heartland Institute, about guns, give us a call at 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-12. And Sterling, let's go to Mark in Alaska, and he's got a question. Mark, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Thank you. I appreciate you guys addressing this subject. In Alaska, we enjoy our firearm privileges and rights and, to go hunting and to defend ourselves and so forth. And, the old saying that when seconds count, the police are only minutes away. Well, in Alaska, it might be hours away or days away. And so, people do need to have the ability to protect themselves when they're far from the law enforcement that would normally be there to protect them. And that's for Alaska, and I realize we're unique in that way. But there's rural areas, all throughout our country as well. We are thankful to God that we have that codified in our Constitution, the Second Amendment, to protect our rights. But really, it's a God-given right. And in 1 Corinthians 13, it talks about love always protects. That's something that God has established. It's not our U.S. Constitution a couple hundred years ago. This is something God told his people. Love always protects. That's an important aspect of love. And so that's one thing. But the real question that I have for you, Merrill, and your guest, I wanted to know, in any current legislation, is it true that they're trying to, some of these anti-Second Amendment legislators, congressmen, and senators are trying to make it unaffordable for the average guy to own firearms and ammunition by putting heavy taxes on them, as well as requiring an insurance policy that costs $800 in order to be a firearms owner.
Good question.
In addition to registering and so on. So are some of those rumors true, or is this just more stuff that's floating around the internet to, get people stirred up?
Sterling?
Well, I can't speak to the tax. I can't speak to the insurance issue. That might be contained in Sheila Jackson Lee's. I'm ashamed to say that my home state turns out a legislator named Sheila Jackson Lee, longtime legislator from, I believe, the Houston area. And she has proposed one of the most serious gun control bills out there. And they have in the past, and I think this is in Sheila's bill, and some states have looked at this too, imposed taxes on ammunition and firearms. I think in California they wanted to impose a tax on ammunition that was greater than the cost of the ammunition itself, so it would be more than double the cost of ammunition. And of course, that doesn't affect the wealthy elite who passed these laws. That affects the average Joe, and of course, that's who they want to control. The elite always wants to control the average folks, whether for their own gain, or because they're paternalists and they think they know best how everyone ought to live, and you're not responsible enough to know how to control your own life, so we're going to do that for you. And so they impose taxes that are regressive and hurt the poor. They would take away your ability to purchase ammunition, not by making it illegal, just by making it too expensive to do so. So that's probably, the taxes might be in Sheila Jackson Lee's bill. I don't know about the insurance. The thing about both Biden's proposals, his requests, they have to get through Congress. The Second Amendment is a pretty high bar to get over. He's going to try and get laws passed through Congress. The House, there are probably enough votes in the House to pass it. You may get a couple of Democrats break away. You may get a couple of Republicans to support some of these gun control proposals. But there'll be enough votes in the House. The question is whether he can get it through the Senate. And, of course, that's very doubtful unless they get rid of the filibuster. There's not enough votes in the Senate to pass this stuff.
Thank you, Mark. But Sterling, what he brought up was an interesting point because Congress can do things directly and it can do things indirectly. Yeah. And one of the indirect ways it might do that was to say, we want you to have, for lack of a better term, personal liability insurance on your guns to make sure that if somebody gets harmed, there's liability coverage that helps them. And of course, we have I think virtually every state, 47 of them anyway, I believe, require liability insurance on your car. It can be a fairly big expense, but most of us pay that because we feel like we have to have a car. We might not think that much about with guns. So, but you could, if you put in a fairly expensive, some type of liability insurance, if you own each gun that you have, you could essentially make it unaffordable, not because of the cost of the gun, but because of the insurance.
Well, let's be clear. Guns and cars are two different things. I've read the Constitution. I've never seen the word car, truck, or vehicle anywhere. Arms is protected by the Second Amendment of the Constitution. And it does not have a qualifier in there that says, and it must be insured. It ain't in there.
But let me ask you this.
That would be a harder road to hoe. And even if they pass the liability insurance, I don't see how it could be per gun. You own guns. Remember, states pass the laws on cars and trucks. Mm-hmm. That would have to be passed at the state level. Federal has no role in telling you, it's you in a state, you must insure your guns, and on a per gun basis as opposed to a household. I carry liability. I think it's a very different thing. I don't think they can get away with that. I know certainly it would wind up in court, and it is a backdoor way of gun control. Now, what they could do is the taxes. Now, remember, this would have been academic, I think, before Obamacare. Mm-hmm. No one could have imagined before Obamacare the federal government could tell you, you must carry health insurance, mm-hmm. and if you don't, we're going to force you to pay for a government plan because you're going to be covered one way or the other. And then the Supreme Court, with Roberts being the deciding vote, said, oh, it's a tax, and so that's okay because the federal government can tax.
Right.
Well, they could try and do that with guns as well, right? You must carry insurance, and if you don't, you have to pay this fee to pay for the public health care cost of people harmed with guns. I guess they could try and do that, but Obamacare was, 2012, and
passed in 2010 and went into effect in 2014.
2010. And so it's 11 years later, we're still debating it, and the individual mandate only went away. So I think that would be a tough road to make. But they could raise taxes. They could raise taxes. They've got a tax on guns now and ammunition now, and they could do that.
We've got a little over a minute left in this segment. How much you mentioned the difficulty in getting some things through the Senate? How much of this might be able to be done by executive order?
Well, I think he's going to try and get a lot done with executive order. What they could try and do is classify any magazine over 10 rounds or any semi-automatic assault rifle, certain mechanisms. They could try and reclassify them as covered under the act that regulates machine guns. So for every assault weapon you own, you got to pay a tax. You got to go through an FBI background check. They can try and do that. That's how they did bump stocks. That's how they've done silencers. I just think it's going to be a heavy lift, no matter how they try and do it. But through executive order, it's even more tenuous because executive orders are not laws. Technically, they're supposed to be mandates from the president directing federal agencies how to act, not individual people how to act.
Yes, and of course, Barack Obama dramatically increased the elements of executive orders, and we were writing at the time that that's going to come back to haunt you because Republicans are going to be in sometime, and Donald Trump did a number of executive orders. I don't know that a lot of them had a big impact, but that seems to be the way they want to go rather than moving through legislation. 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to talk to Dr. H. Sterling Burnett in our final segment, we're going to look at what states are doing when we come back, because states can impose a number of laws as well, and it varies depending upon the state. So stay with us. We'll be back with Sterling Burnett in just a minute.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we're back with our final segment with Dr. Sterling Burnett of the Heartland Institute. So, Sterling, we've been promoting this, but we haven't got to it yet. What are some of the states doing on gun regulation? Because they can be, I guess, as bad as the government in trying to restrict our rights.
Well, they can be worse than the federal government because they have more leeway under the Constitution. Technically, the Second Amendment was only applied against the federal government. Mm-hmm. Now, it has been more recently through concealed carry laws, the Supreme Court expanded that and applied its protections to some extent against the states. But this is interesting. Let's talk about this for a second, because it's not that so many states are enacting stricter gun laws, though there are some. What's happening in the states is a backlash against federal regulation. That's the dominant theme there. We've had 2 states in the last month that have passed what's called constitutional carry. I think there's 18 states now that you're allowed to carry a firearm. If you're a legal person allowed to own a firearm, you're allowed to carry it without a concealed carry permit. 2 states joined that, Utah and Montana. Other states are considering it. You've got a number of states and certainly a lot of counties and cities that are becoming what are called sort of a mimic of the sanctuary city for immigration.
Right.
Well, they're becoming Second Amendment sanctuary cities or sanctuary counties. And what that means, so in some cases, it's just a resolution saying we're in favor of the Second Amendment. You shouldn't pass more laws. But in other situations, it's much more legalistic. They say that if the federal government passes new laws, their law enforcement in their county or their city is precluded from helping enforce those laws. So the FBI or the ATF couldn't come to you and say, hey, we've got a warrant out for the arrest of this guy because he owns a gun that we say he can't own under these new laws. Could you go pick him up? No, sorry, we're precluded by law from helping you. And Supreme Court precedent, there's not enough federal agents in the world to go door to door as they would have to do. They need the help of local law enforcement to do these things. So these cities and states are passing laws saying, no, we will not enforce federal laws. That's on you, buddy. And some places, they've gone even a step farther. At least one place in Missouri, they've said, if a federal agent comes into our jurisdiction and tries to enforce a federal law that we think is unconstitutional, we'll arrest the federal agent. Now, my suspicion is the supremacy clause would be quickly used right then to overturn that. Federal agents are allowed to enforce federal law. But the courts have held in a gun control case that you may not co-opt state and local law enforcement for federal purposes. So they can't make them enforce federal gun control laws, any new ones.
Let's go to Peter in Maine. And Peter has a comment. Peter, you're on the air.
Thank you. My comment is really just, I'm listening to the radio, and one of the things I like to say is that I'm really very sick and tired of either Barack Obama or Joe Biden talking about assault weapons. They don't look at the good thing that an assault weapon can do if you to protect 1,000 or 1,100 people or more in church.
Yes.
And the other thing I have to say is that why don't they spend more time looking after criminals and executing them? We don't execute enough people here in the United States, because if they started to execute people left and right, premeditated murderers only, they would slow down of the crime.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Let's get a response from Sterling.
Well, I actually am a supporter of the death penalty, and it's been delayed for far too long for too many instances. I don't think we need to start executing left and right. But I will say this, these laws about assault weapons, they're not assault weapons. They're semi-automatic firearms that have been around for a century. And they want to regulate arms that are in normal use. Why? Because they have characteristics that make them look like a military weapon. Mm-hmm. Well, that's like, I have a kit car that looks like a Corvette, and we're going to ban kit cars. Someone can own a Corvette, but you can't own the kit car that looks like a Corvette. Well, because that's what assault weapons are. They look like how they define them, by characteristics that make them look like something the military uses. But that doesn't make them military firearms. They're not. Those are already regulated by federal law.
And let's go to George in South Carolina. George, you're on the air.
Thanks for taking my call. I've heard from some reputable sources, and I read my NRA publication just this weekend, that the CEOs of the ammo companies say they're producing ammo as quick as they can, But, they usually, most stores get deliveries twice a week. And this was in the NRA magazine, and they say within hours of getting a delivery, everything is gone. The shelves are bare. So they the people in the ammo company say, yes, we're producing just as fast as we can. People are, hoarding ammunition just like they're buying guns left and right.
Sterling?
Well, I'm 100% sure that's true. Yeah, I mean, during the recent cold spell here in Texas, you couldn't find milk, water, or anything on the shelves. After COVID, you couldn't find toilet paper. People are doing the same thing with guns and ammo. And that's going to be one of the really difficult things. If they pass any of these laws, like the private transfer of arms, so many guns have been bought and sold or traded between private individuals for so long, there's no way of knowing. If they started it today, there'd be no way of knowing whether a particular arm that I owned was sold before or after the law was passed.
That's right.
It would be, they're talking about passing laws that are basically impossible to enforce.
Thank you, George. Well, Sterling, in compliments we have left, take 30 seconds or so to tell us what people should be considering. Is there anything we could be doing out there as individuals?
Well, I'd say go to your legislators and tell them you want constitutional carry here in Texas. You want Texas to be a sanctuary state for the Second Amendment. That there should be no question that we're not going to enforce unconstitutional additional violations of our gun rights. And, not just in Texas, but I would go to every state legislature and do that. Now, let's be honest. In some states, that's going to go over like a lead balloon. California's not going to pass that law.
Right.
Massachusetts, New York, they're not going to pass those laws. But there are a lot of states out there, and if enough states revolt, say no more, I think even Washington would have to listen then.
My guest for this hour is Dr. H. Sterling Burnett with the Heartland Institute. We've been talking about guns. If you want to find out more about the Heartland Institute or Sterling, go to pointofview.net, and we have information and links there. Thank you so much for joining us, Sterling.
Thanks for having me on.
Sterling's a great guy, and he's very knowledgeable both on this and on environmental issues. When we come back for our last hour, we're going to turn to George Washington, entrepreneur. John Berlau of the Competitive Enterprise Institute has just published a book, came out this past summer, on George Washington, and he's got a whole different take on that. A look at George Washington that most of us have not really heard much of before. We hear about the statesman, we hear about the military man, but we don't hear much about his business acumen, and he was a very astute businessman and did very well in business starting from younger ages. So stay with us. We're going to come back with John Berlau to talk about George Washington, entrepreneur, here on Point of View.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back to Point of View. I'm Merrill Matthews with the Institute for Policy Innovation, sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. And I've been looking forward to this hour because we're going to go to talk to John Berlau of the Competitive Enterprise Institute about a new book he has published. Came out a few months ago, I think late summer. George Washington, Entrepreneur. I'm holding up a copy here for those who are viewing online. The subtitle is How Our Founding Fathers' Private Business Pursuits Changed America and the World. So you'll capture from that subtitle there how different this is than what we mostly think about George Washington, whether it's George Washington, the military leader, or it's George Washington, the statesman and our first president. That's how we generally think of him, and yet John Berlau has looked into his business interest and his background in that, and has just presented a really interesting new book here that'll give us a new perspective on him. John Berlau is a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute in Washington. He focuses on how public policy affects access to capital, entrepreneurship, and investments made by the public and business community. He is a contributing editor for Forbes. He, before joining CEI, Berlau was an award-winning financial and political journalist. He served as a Washington correspondent for Investors Business Daily. That's where I first met him. And a staff writer for Insight Magazine. He is a graduate from the University of Missouri-Columbia in 1994 with degrees in both journalism and economics. John, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Matthews.
Well, I'm just so thrilled about your book because it makes me a really smart person about George Washington, because I can talk about something other than him being the first president and where he was at the Continental Congress and things of that nature. So tell us, the book just came out recently. What gave you the idea for the book? Why did you decide to go with this book?
Well, some of the reasons I decided to write my book, George Washington, Entrepreneur, thanks for your kind words about it, available where books are sold, and was that I, as you said, I do things about looking at policies, how they affect access to capital for entrepreneurs, including middle-class entrepreneurs just starting out. And when I found out that George Washington built these enterprises, such as having the whiskey distillery, when Mount Vernon, I give credit to them, started building his old enterprises, I thought, what a way, for a struggle for entrepreneurs in America to relate to him, and this shows our nation was rooted in capitalism and entrepreneurship.
Now, I'm going to show a copy of the book. It's and I'll show the side on it. It's not a long book. How long did it take you to put it together?
Well, if you take all the time I researched on this topic, I would say even close to 10 years I've been writing about this. And they started in 2012, I think. But then in about 2 years ago, an agent I'm friends with, Jennifer Cohen, she was just becoming an agent, decided to pitch this book, and Macmillan, St. Martin's Press, thought it was a good idea, so I had been working for them. But even then, it took some time, from 2017, 2018. I did some research, went to Mount Vernon, I did a draft. There were some changes the publisher made, so I did another draft. So I would do it in been pockets where I would do this intensely for 3 months, but I'd say it just took about 2.5 years to put together.
Now, what did you do to gather all this material? Because you get, it's not a detailed book in the sense that you sort of, your eyes glaze over as you're reading it, but it's clear, I mean, you're going through letters of George Washington. There's a book about the George Washington's library, the books he bought over time. What did you have to do to gather this material?
Well, I went to Mount Vernon, and they were very helpful. We would email them about some things. I went to other sites like Williamsburg, where he served in the House of Burgesses and where Martha Washington was from. But fortunately for me and for your listeners, is that a lot of George Washington's papers, including his business letters, are now online if you go to places like the Mount Vernon Digital Encyclopedia. So if I wanted his thoughts on certain things, like everything from tobacco to pineapples, which he loved, I could just hit that word in the search engine on the Mount Vernon Digital Encyclopedia, and if there was a letter or something he wrote about it and it's been cataloged, it's there. There's still a lot of letters because he kept, voluminous business correspondence that haven't been put online yet, but that's hoping to be finished. The University of Virginia and Mount Vernon hope to finish that by the middle of this decade.
Now, we know of George Washington and, of course, Mount Vernon, but he actually came from a long line of businessmen and landowners. This wasn't new to his family heritage.
Well, he did do a lot of new things,
yes,
like as far as growing wheat in Virginia and instead of tobacco, and breeding mules and other things. But yes, he came from a lot of his great grandfather came over here after being with not very much from England, and then his father was Augustine Washington, built one of the first iron furnace smelting facilities and mines in Virginia when iron was just beginning to be important in the industrial age. So you can say, the Washington. I have a chapter called "The Iron Roots of George Washington and then the Washington family."
And they were buying land. His father was, and some others for some time. I mean, for years before, they were accumulating land, I guess you'd say.
Yes, they were, and and also the fact that his father was smart enough to get part of the mining company, the Principio Group, for putting mining iron on his land, and he bought up land around it. However, George didn't really inherit that much from his father. In those days, the oldest sons did, so his two older half brothers got most of that, and he had to sort of start from scratch as far as what he built as a surveyor.
My guest for this hour is John Berlau. He is a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and he's just released a new book, George Washington, Entrepreneur: How Our Founding Fathers' Private Business Pursuits Changed America and the World. So we're talking about that. We'll take your questions later on, but we've got a number of things to go through as we discuss some of the issues there about Washington, his life, and his business pursuits. If you want to find out more about John, we've got information on our website, pointofview.net. You can go there to find out more about him. We also have a link to the book, and I'd encourage you to go and check on that link and get a copy of it. It will make you sound much smarter about George Washington than most of your friends. So stay with us. We're going to be back in a few minutes as we continue looking at George Washington and what he was involved in. He was an inventor himself. Most people don't know that, but he was also, I think John says, something of an early hedge fund or angel investor, because he went and helped other inventors be able to develop their products and get them marketed. And he also was one of the first people to trademark his name, George Washington Wheat. Have you ever heard of that? Stay with us. We'll be back in just a minute.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You know, Christians are surrounded by a supermarket of worldviews, so it's not surprising that many have uncritically accepted many of these false views of reality. The Barna Group, in association with Summit Ministries, conducted a survey of practicing Christians to determine how they were influenced by these worldviews. What they found is that younger Christians, that would be millennials and Generation X, were much more likely to accept unbiblical worldviews than previous generations. And they also found that males were more susceptible than females by a 2-to-1 ratio. They found that more than 6 in 10 of practicing Christians accept some ideas that are rooted in the new spirituality. They also found that more than a third of practicing Christians are sympathetic to some teachings of Islam. Apparently, these practicing Christians do not see how some of their views are illogical. For example, more than a quarter believe that all people pray to the same God or spirit. Praying to Allah, Krishna, or the God of the Bible would obviously be very different, but that does not seem to many of these Christians to be a contradiction. On issues of morality and values, many also differ from Orthodox Christianity. Nearly a quarter of them believe that what is morally right or wrong depends on what an individual believes. 1 in 5 believe that meaning and purpose come from working hard. A significant number also accept ideas promoted by socialism. Some strongly agree with the idea that the government, rather than individuals, should control as much of the resources as necessary to ensure that everyone gets a fair share, and others believe that private property encourages greed and envy. This survey is but one more reminder that we need to be teaching sound theology in our churches. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you hear on Viewpoints by visiting pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And welcome back. Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson. And on the line with me today is John Berlau of the Competitive Enterprise Institute. And we're talking about his new book, George Washington, Entrepreneur. Now, John, you mentioned, you discuss his efforts as a surveyor. And I think a lot of us, when we learn about the early history of George Washington, we hear he got to start surveying. But it was actually fairly young, as I believe you said he started about the age of, roughly around the age of 14 and continues doing this till the age of about 20, I believe it was. And he actually becomes very, very good at surveying and in high demand and makes pretty good money. And it teaches him about land. Tell us about his surveying experience.
Yes. Well, he would start with his father's surveying, his late father's surveying tools around Mount Vernon, which was then owned by his older brother. And he would go there. Then he went on an expedition in what is now the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, and to see if land was suitable for farming. He did that was working for the Fairfax family, which is, Lord Fairfax and what Fairfax County in the D.C. area is named for today. And then he would get all kinds of plum jobs across Virginia, including laying out the streets, they're still there today, for the city of Alexandria, which is now a big Washington suburb. So he developed a very good reputation, and at the same time, it gave him an eye to spot prime land. And so sometimes he would use his wages to buy some of the land he saw. Sometimes he would actually get paid with parcels of the land he would survey. So that developed his career as a real estate investor speculator that he did for the rest of his life, buying land as far out as what is now Ohio.
And he didn't have a very long formal education. I think I get the sense he may have felt somewhat shorted by that, but he didn't get a long education. But that doesn't mean he wasn't educated, at least from his own efforts. You cite a book that looks at the books that he bought, and he bought a number of books, not so much, I think, philosophy and things of that nature that you might expect from Thomas Jefferson, but many practical books that helped him learn more about business.
Yes, George Washington read all kinds of books, and that's what Kevin Hayes at Liven Books just did. The thing about actually looking at what he ordered, what was in the inventory in his library, and actually seeing some. We have some of the books that George Washington actually underlined. Like we know, for instance, he read and underlined passages in Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations that came out in 1776 and laid the foundations of capitalism. In fact, he said the word invisible hand, which Smith said, Washington said in his first inauguration. So he would read that. He would read like philosophers like John Locke, books about religion, would read and see Shakespeare plays and frequently quoted Shakespeare in his letters. But he would read a lot of practical books like what is the latest in agriculture, how to plant wheat, how to plant hemp, and how to care for horses and do jumps. I mean, Jefferson and others, talked about that Washington was the greatest horseman that they ever saw. And people were saying Washington got that from experience and natural ability, which he no doubt did. But Washington, when he would actually read books about horsemanship and how to do jumps, when Washington had a question about how to do something, he would both ask people and he would, if there were books available on it, he would get it.
And apparently he learned something about dogs because you said that he did some dog breeding, and the American Kennel Club, I believe you said, has a breed that's essentially he started.
Yes, I think he's known as the father of the American foxhound, as well as the American mule, and for farming, the American mule. He would breed a horse and a donkey for that.
And people learned from him on that, and actually he used mules or his horses to sell their services.
Yes, and of course mules, before you had big tractors, those were so essential for plowing.
They were. Now, you also mentioned that, you mentioned some of the people he was reading. He read Thomas Paine. He was friends with Thomas Paine. But you suggest that George Washington and Thomas Paine may have conducted the first scientific experiment on American land, which is interesting because we tend to think of Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin as sort of the intellectual, very scientific thinking founding fathers. But George Washington did one of the early scientific experiments in the U.S.?
Yes. Well, it's considered technically the first in the nation. This is a Rutgers University professor, I quote, says that it was because it was done as the war was ending and as the Treaty of Paris had already been in 1783 had already been signed. So it was coming. It was coming. It had been signed. It was coming back. Sailing. You couldn't fly it in a plane. So it was technically the first scientific experiment in America. Also, the Rutgers University professor I had talked to said it may have been as significant as not more than Ben Franklin's experiment with the kite and electricity. This was where they put paper torches in the river in southern New Jersey, and found that it set that part of the river on fire, proving that there was proving the existence of natural gas. And that in an experiment in 1776, Paine would later write about this experiment, helped prove that there was natural gas, and which is so used so much for energy. It was done in right in the this is where Washington was commanding at the time in his residence, and Paine was his house guest, but right in the area where there's fracking in the Pennsylvania region.
And just to be clear, Washington did this before there was was any fracking out there, but a natural gas or perhaps methane bubbles were bubbling up from the in the river, and it was setting fire onto the river, and it had nothing to do with the energy industry. It was a natural occurrence.
Yes. Well, it was natural, except for the fact that they were putting paper torches in there from a boat, from a little boat. But they were proving they had heard about it in Washington, and also in some of the land he bought in what is now Ohio. The burning had heard about a surveyor found a burning spring where there was areas of natural gas. So Washington was fascinated with that and scientific trends like that.
Now, Washington initially was a tobacco planter, but he began to abandon that for wheat and other products. Why did he turn away from tobacco when that was such a big product there for the colonies?
Well, yes, it was a big product and was also sort of a symbol of social status. You know, if you planted tobacco, you weren't a farmer, you were a planter. But Washington could see it was problematic for a number of reasons, not having to because it was politically incorrect or they didn't know it was bad for your health, but that it was harming Mount Vernon soil, which has been confirmed that it can harm soil a lot, and also that tobacco was primarily for export to England, and so it was dependent on so many things like what the shippers would charge, other things like British duties on it, to export it, taxes which were being raised, and so he saw wheat was and crops like that. There was more of a domestic market for that. He saw some of the German immigrants farmers on smaller scale doing wheat, so he's like, well, why not a big farm like Mount Vernon, which he had inherited when his brother had some of it when his brother had passed away. So. Who had originally had it. So he decided to, over a couple of years, he quit planting tobacco and diversified with wheat and hemp and just several other types of crops, was a pioneer in crop rotation and land conservation. And then he would eventually vertically integrate some of his enterprises and use the wheat for a grist mill to make flour, which he put the G. Washington brand on as his signature, and would export throughout the colonies to Great Britain and to the British West Indies.
My guest for this hour is John Berlau. He is with the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and he's written a book, George Washington Entrepreneur, and we're talking about a number of aspects where George Washington was himself an entrepreneur, an inventor, and helped finance other entrepreneurs out there and inventors. If you'd like to talk to John, have a question about George Washington, 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. We'll open up the line after the break, so you can ask John a question about that. You can also find out more about John or the Competitive Enterprise Institute at pointofview.net, and we also have a link to his book, so you can go there, link on that. I'd encourage you to do that because it is a very fascinating read, something we don't hear much about George Washington. So when we come back, we're going to look more at some of these things where George Washington actually bumped into a number of regulations that made it very difficult for Americans to compete in this land. Stay with us. We'll be back on Point of View.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team. and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, your guest host for Point of View.
And welcome back. Merrill Matthews sitting in for Kirby Anderson today. And we're talking with John Berlau of the Competitive Enterprise Institute about his new book, George Washington, Entrepreneur. 1-800-351-1212 if you'd like to talk to John or have a question for him. 1-800-351-1212. And John, let's take a quick jaunt out to Georgia and talk to Edwin, who has a question for you. Edwin, you're on the air.
Hi, Edwin.
Yes, sir. I have a question concerning finance. I know any successful entrepreneurial undertaking is preceded by good quality planning. And for example, you mentioned that George Washington had a distillery on his property. For example, did he get a construction loan through the current financial processes then to actually build a thing, like have a construction loan, for example?
It's a very good question, Edwin, because they didn't have banks and things that we would normally have today in the colonial period. John?
Yes, they were starting banks, and they were doing banks of Alexandria. I don't know specifically. Mount Vernon may have that information. I think at that point he had enough money from the other crops and things he was making to do that. He may have sold some of his land too, which he was always doing, buying and selling. So I don't know that he got any specific loans for the distillery. I do know that he actually would start in and sort of pioneered some of the joint stock companies of shares. Like he formed the Potomac company to make improvements, in which he was a shareholder, as well as the James River company to make improvements on the Potomac and James River to make them more navigable. So he would, was involved in that aspect of finance. I don't know if specifically he had things for the distillery. I do know it's sort of with tobacco. You were, and this was one of the things he wanted to get away from. The colonists were sort of borrowing on their tobacco what the merchants would pay them, and sort of what the British would pay them. British merchants, and sort of would get an advance on their farms, and that they would trade that for some of the goods. So there were things like lending, and I guess you would call it collateralized loans, but it is a fascinating area because there were a lot of back then there were a lot of sophisticated legal documents that you had to master in business.
Thank you, Edwin. John, the one thing that you mentioned, I believe, Washington became something of an investor for other entrepreneurs and provided some initial capital or helped them out. Discuss that a little bit.
Yes, well, I mentioned the Potomac Company. Washington was interested. He had an interest, just for the new nation, but also, financially. After he retired from the war as a general, when he could have basically been America's new king, in 1783, when he decided, no, I want to come home to my own private kingdom of Mount Vernon. He went, one of the things he was interested in as a private citizen was improving, both for himself and for others, because Mount Vernon's right on there on the Potomac River, is navigation for the river. So he was also interested not just in improving navigation, but the kind of sea craft that could, because everything was by the water. Then there weren't really good roads with the horses, so water was a serious thing. And he found this gentleman in the western part of Virginia when he went there in 1784, James Rumsey, who was building a sort of an automatic boat with perpetual motion, and he he employed James Rumsey at the Potomac Company, which he was an investor in, and also wrote a letter of endorsement for this boat, this mechanical boat. Then was helpful in getting James Rumsey state patents in Maryland and Virginia before there was a U.S. Patent Office. Rumsey would eventually add steam to his boat and sail it 7 miles around Shepherdstown, West Virginia in 1787, and is considered the co-inventor of the steamboat. And when Washington was president and signed the bill establishing the U.S. Patent Office, Rumsey and John Fitch, for another inventor from up north, would be granted the patent for the steamboat. And then 20 years later, around 1807, Robert Fulton would successfully commercialize it.
You mentioned in the book that that the colony, these were colonies, and the British perceived the America as colonies, and we know this from our history, but the colonies were there to serve the Brits and not necessarily to serve each other or to prosper within the colonies themselves. They were there to help the British prosper, and so they passed a number of laws, and you talk about some of those. I think the Iron Act, the Hat Act, and the Wool Act, which were made it very, very difficult for the colonists to actually engage in business, because if they were creating materials, say iron, some of this stuff had to be shipped back to Great Britain, where they would then process it and make products for it, and then ship back to the colonies to be sold as a final product. And that made it much more expensive when the colonies could have actually done a number of the things themselves. They were just prohibited for that. There were a lot of regulations that made it hard for the colonies to actually exist economically.
That's very true. Yes, and that's one of the things I discovered. It is well known about the taxes and that Great Britain was controlling their trade routes. They could only really export to Britain and import from Britain when there were a lot of other markets. I mean, Washington was upset because he couldn't get Portuguese salt. He had to get salt from Liverpool, which is for his fish. Among his other businesses were a fishery that he fished, herring and shad out from the Potomac River. Had huge nets, and they have that amount for it. But also he had a blacksmith shop that was making horseshoes and was selling to other people. And according to the Iron Act, even though, as we mentioned with Washington's father, the British encouraged the actual mining of raw iron, that it made it illegal for Americans to make the American colonies to make the most basic things, including hammers, sickles, nails, knives with iron. That the British wanted everything shipped, the raw iron shipped to Britain, and then have it shipped back by the colonies by British manufacturers. The only thing they wanted the colonies to do was to supply them with goods from the farm, and this was raised costs and cut off a lot of creative enterprises that Americans were forming. One of the objections to the Stamp Act was not just the cost of it, was that they had to use British paper for it, whereas Benjamin Franklin and others were investing in American paper mills. So all of this is one of the things that pushed Washington, who was a loyal soldier in the French and Indian War, toward revolution. He wrote in a 1769 letter to fellow founding father George Mason that he feared that the British could restrain my manufactories, in his own word.
Another thing that you mentioned there is the problem of money, because they can't mint money in the colonies, and there wasn't enough British money around, so they had to use various things. And so, and this is interesting in the day of Bitcoin, when that's out here, they had to find ways to create money there.
Yes, because the Great Britain wouldn't let the states coin their own money, and they would not, or build mints there to put their gold and silver into into denominations of pounds. So there was always a shortage of the official currency that Britain required, and that's one of the issues with the Stamp Act. There really wasn't enough money there to pay it. But one of the things people would use as money, and was sort of the cryptocurrency of its day, were tobacco warehouse receipts, where you would have a receipt from a tobacco warehouse good for a certain amount of tobacco, and then that just circulated a la cryptocurrency today to just end up paying for, you would use it to pay for everything. Throughout the colony, sort of the first national currency.
Business finds a way to make things work, even when the government's trying its best to prohibit it from doing so, it looks like. My guest for this hour and for the last segment we'll have is John Berlau. He is a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and we're talking about his book, George Washington, Entrepreneur. If you have a question or a comment for John, coming up for our final segment, 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. And you can find out more about John, or you can find out about his book by going to pointofview.net. It is a great little book, so it's not not something that takes a long time, and it's written very well for the average reader. So I think you'll find a lot of information there. When we come back, we want to find out about why they decided to put George Washington in charge of the military. It may be because he was a successful businessman, and that may have given them a hint that he might be a successful military leader as well. Stay with us, 1-800-351-1212, and we'll be back in just a minute on Point of View.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And we're back for our final segment with John Berlau of the Competitive Enterprise Institute and his book, George Washington, Entrepreneur. John, you mentioned in there that one reason, certainly not the only one, but one reason why George Washington was given charge of the troops for the American Revolution was that he was a successful businessman. And I found that interesting because I suspect a number of people who voted for Donald Trump, certainly on his first election in 2016, felt like here's a person who's been a very successful business person. If somebody is going to be able to build a wall, a good wall for less money, and do certain things like that, bringing somebody with some business expertise into the government isn't a bad thing. Tell us about George Washington and why they thought he was a successful business person.
Well, yes, Dr. Matthews, it still vexes historians, and it's still not completely known how the Continental Congress from, all 13 colonies, in a day where there really wasn't, communication and transportation like we have today. So you didn't know as much about somebody, say, in another colony, and you didn't have instant communication. How they would have chosen George Washington unanimously on the first ballot. And there have been a couple speculations, that he wore his military uniform and had this experience in the French and Indian War, and that's a part of it. Although he did have some stumbles in the French and Indian War and didn't have that distinguished a record. And Adams vouching for him, John Adams, seems to be one of the things that counted. John Adams being from Massachusetts. But one of the things Adams mentioned in his speech was, among other things, he mentioned Washington's a gentleman whose skill and experience as an officer, whose independent fortune, great talent. So Washington's independent fortune was I think obviously a reference to Washington's business prowess, and it could be that because Washington was exporting this flour under a brand name, that people in other colonies were certainly familiar with it. So it's like another host mentioned, even back in the 18th century, you establish a particular brand, it can lead you to being general and president.
Now, I believe you're speaking at Mount Vernon in a month or two, are you not?
This month, March 17th, St. Patrick's Day.
Now, what I'd like to do is give people, I've been to Mount Vernon, it's a fascinating place to be, but give people a little bit of a sense as to what, from the entrepreneur side of George Washington, you'd be able to find if you go to Mount Vernon.
Yes. Well, you would be able to find in the past 15 years, they have rebuilt his grist mill where he made the trademark flour, and the whiskey distillery where they have a license from the state of Virginia to manufacture and sell whiskey based on its old recipe. I have some, and I'm not by any means a whiskey connoisseur, but I found it pretty good. So and just also things like, they have an interactive museum where they show and you can smell the fish in its fishery. Now there's a 4D theater where you can, see called B Washington, where you can be, interactive as far as, what would you do as far as, making a decision, and then compare that to George Washington. Mount Vernon takes no government funding, and it's a pretty entrepreneurial story in itself. It was started just by some women who wanted to preserve Washington's legacy in the 1850s, and they're like, if the men can't do it, let's have the ladies step up. So it is still run by the Ladies League of Mount Vernon, and it's just and they've gotten support over the years from Henry Ford and Thomas Edison and other American entrepreneurs.
Now, we can't leave this without mentioning Martha Washington, and of course they got married. She had assets herself as because she was a widow, but we don't know as much about Martha as we know about, say, Abigail Adams. But tell us a little bit about Martha.
Yes, we do. Unfortunately, we don't, because Martha, as was the 18th century custom, burned all the letters between her and George, and there are only about 3 remaining between the two of them. Whereas, for whatever reason, the Adams did not do this, and there are about 1,100 letters between John and Abigail that are still circulating, still around, and have been, filed and put online, and we're able to be the basis of the HBO movie. But we know about Martha like we know about George from their business correspondence, and what we know is that Martha was a savvy businessman. She had come from humble origins like George did, but had married one of the wealthiest men in Virginia, in the Williamsburg area. And then after he passed, and she was a single mother with 2 kids, and because she really didn't have like an older brother who could do this for her, as was a custom, would negotiate with some of the tobacco merchants and others that, and as on price and other things that her husband did. And then when she at Mount Vernon, of course, George was gone for some time, so she managed a lot of that, and also ran some of the textile operations, including making things like bedspreads. So I always say there is a connection between mattress sales and Washington's birthday, that this is one of the products George and Martha made as entrepreneurs.
Now, they sort of celebrate the relationship between John Adams and Abigail, but it seems like George and Martha had a very good relationship as far as we know, too, didn't they?
they were very good life. They were life partners, and you can tell from the letters that do exist, also the way they talked about each other, that they were very much in love. And you know this because George sent for Martha to be with him, and when he was with the troops, every year during the Revolution, she would come there, and it was a rough ride. I mean, if you can imagine, both just. There weren't really any roads as far as with your horse, and there was a war going on. So, but yet she managed, and she helped him, helped the troops, and so it was a very loving, loving marriage. She added substantial assets, but she added a lot more.
And George was away a lot because of the Revolution. Did she manage most of Mount Vernon while he was gone?
He did have overseers, but she managed quite a bit of it. She sort of had keys to everything that she would carry around, and so certainly some of the making textiles and bedspread, which they made for sale as well as Mount Vernon used, and clothes, and they were making more things as they were boycotting the British. So she supervised all of that.
And I guess I would say, in closing here, George Washington bumped up against a lot of British regulations and seemed to have come away with something of what we might call today a sort of a free market sense of you need to be able to allow businesses to operate. What's your take on that?
Well, we know, as I said before, that he read Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, which was sort of laid the foundations of capitalism and open trade as opposed to British mercantilism. That you don't have barriers to entry. You let enlightened self-interest. He was also concerned from his inaugural address, which is most noted, where he talks about foreign policy and entangling alliances, which is very important, about lawmaking power being put into the executive branch, and the executive branch usurping the legislature as far as making laws, as far as enforcing that. And we talk about that at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, that is still very much that his prophecy has come true, that unfortunately that's a problem today with the administrative state, where you have unelected bureaucrats making rules that have nothing to do with the laws that they have are based on, such as when a little puddle on your farm is suddenly considered a navigable waterway that's subject to the full weight of the federal government.
Well, John, thank you so much for joining us. A very interesting book. Thank you.
Thank you so much. George Washington, Entrepreneur, available where books are sold.
And you can get a link to that on the Point of View website. And I'd encourage you to go there to find out more about that book and to find out more about John. And so, thank you all for joining us. It's been an interesting discussion as we take on this issue of George Washington, Entrepreneur. I thank you for joining us, and we will be back tomorrow.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.